28th, 1575. Shitaragahara Plain, central Japan. The ground shook before you could even see them. First, the vibration. A rhythmic pulse rising through tree roots and hardened soil, reaching the soles of every gunner's feet as they gripped their arquebuses. Then, the sound. Not the noise of a charge. Something more primitive than that. The thunder of 10,000 hooves striking in unison. A percussion that wooden structures had absorbed, and that now exploded through the Rengogawa River Valley like a promise of annihilation. And then you saw them. The Takeda Cavalry. The most feared mounted force in all of Japan surging across the plain. Lacquered red and black armor catching the morning light. Lances lowered. Riders crouched over their horses' manes. Speed, mass, momentum. All of it converging on a single intention. To break the line ahead of them. The line ahead of them was made of bamboo. Wooden and bamboo stakes driven into the ground, arranged in rows before men kneeling with loaded arquebuses. A fence. A crude barrier any child could leap over. Against the most lethal cavalry of the Sengoku period, Oda Nobunaga's generals had erected a fence. That sounds absurd. And if you were any general who had lived before 1575, you would have found it absurd too. The Takeda cavalry had swept across battlefields for decades. It had dismantled larger armies. It had turned the name Takeda into a synonym for inevitable defeat for anyone who faced it in open field. And yet those bamboo stakes were going to stop the charge. Not slow it, not complicate it, annihilate it. In this video, we're going to understand exactly how that happened. And I can tell you right now, it's not the story you think you know. Because the answer isn't, Oda Nobunaga was a genius, though he was. It isn't, the guns were too powerful, because for decades they weren't. The answer lies in the architecture, in a specific combination of physical obstacles and firing rhythm that solved in one stroke two problems no one had managed to solve simultaneously. But to understand the solution, you need to feel the weight of the problem. And the weight of the problem had a name. Takeda Shingen. There are generals who are remembered for their armies, and there are armies that are remembered for themselves. Forces that become an idea, a myth, something that transcends the commander who created them. The Takeda cavalry was that second kind. To grasp the scale of the challenge at Nagashino, you need to look at what Takeda Shingen built. Shingen was not merely a daimyo, a feudal lord of the Sengoku period. He was a military architect, a man who spent decades refining a single concept: heavy cavalry as the decisive force on the Japanese battlefield. The Takeda domain lay in the Kai region, in the central mountains of Japan, territory that looked more like a liability than an asset. Difficult terrain, scarce agricultural resources, geographic isolation. But Shingen turned that terrain into an advantage. His warriors developed endurance, mobility, and discipline that wealthier plains did not produce. And the horses he bred, and stole, and bought and traded, were the infrastructure of the entire system. The Takeda's central tactic was simple in conception, devastating in execution. The cavalry advanced en masse, collapsed the enemy formation, and the infantry exploited the gap that opened. But the simplicity was deceptive. What made the tactic work was not just force, it was timing. The Takeda cavalry knew exactly when to charge, from which angle, in which sequence. Shingen had spent years calibrating the machine, and the machine worked. At the Battle of Mikatagahara in 1573, Shingen dispatched Tokugawa Ieyasu's army. He didn't just win, he dismantled the Tokugawa formation with an efficiency that bordered on humiliation. Ieyasu barely escaped, and the political and military damage took months to absorb. At Uedihara in 1548, the Takeda destroyed enemy forces in a manner still cited as a tactical example decades later. But the most instructive example was what the Takeda cavalry did psychologically. Before the battle even began, the myth was already at work. Armies that knew they would face the Takeda often took formation with their morale already compromised. Leaders who had the resources for a different approach avoided open confrontation altogether. The reputation was not propaganda. It was the accumulated result of decades of documented dominance. and that, in itself, was a force multiplier. In 1573, Shingen died. The records vary: illness, an arquebus wound, natural causes. What matters is that he died before completing the campaign. Many historians believe would have permanently shifted Japan's balance of power. Shingen was on the march when he fell ill, and with him went the commander who had built the machine. His son Katsuyori inherited the title, and with it, he inherited a problem that would take 2 years to become fatal. Katsuyori was not a bad general. That needs to be stated clearly, because it is easy to turn him into a foolish villain in hindsight. He had demonstrated courage and competence in battle before taking command, but he inherited leadership of a force with its own identity, a cavalry that identified with a specific tradition, commanded by senior generals who had served under Shingen, and who were, each of them, repositories of the institutional memory of that system. The psychological weight was immense. Katsuyori was not Shingen. Everyone knew that, including him. And in a culture where reputation was strategic currency, the pressure to demonstrate that the Takeda were still the Takeda was constant. So Katsuyori did what would make sense for an heir under pressure. He attacked. In 1574, he took Takatenjin Castle. Victory. In other campaigns, he demonstrated that the cavalry still worked, that the name still meant something. And the machine that Shingen had built kept moving, because well-built machines have their own momentum. The problem was that the machine had been calibrated for a specific world. And in 1575, that world was changing faster than any cavalry could pursue. But why would 1575 be any different from all the other times someone had tried to stop the Takeda? That question has an answer. And it doesn't begin with a brilliant general. It begins with a problem no one had solved yet. 12 years before Nagashino, a technological revolution had arrived in Japan. It came by sea, with Portuguese merchants, in 1543, on the island of Tanegashima. The arquebus, the Tanegashima, as the Japanese came to call it, was a simple firearm by European standards. Heavy, slow, sensitive to moisture, with limited accurate range. But it fired a projectile with a force that no armor of the time could comfortably absorb. In theory, it should have meant the end of cavalry. In theory. The problem with the arquebus wasn't the shot. It was what happened afterward. A trained shooter took between 30 seconds and a minute to reload a musket, open the powder, pour it down the barrel, seat the projectile, prepare the fuse, aim. In actual combat, with tension, with smoke, with movement, that time was longer. A charging cavalry covers 400 meters in under a minute. Do the math. A gunner had time for a single effective shot before the cavalry was on top of him. And a single projectile, even if it struck its target, rarely stopped a moving horse with a mounted rider. You would need concentrated fire. And the moment your one shot was fired, you'd be holding a completely useless piece of wood and metal while 500 kilograms of horse and rider bore down on you. The generals of the Sengoku period understood this quickly. The arquebus did not replace cavalry. It complemented the arsenal. You used shooters to inflict casualties before contact, to disorient formations, to exploit fixed defensive positions. But when cavalry charged, you needed cavalry to meet it. That was conventional wisdom. And by every available measure, it was correct wisdom. Oda Nobunaga saw the same problem and asked a different question. Nobunaga was not typical. He came from Owari, a relatively small province, and built his power on a combination of strategic aggression, calculated cruelty, and openness to innovation that unsettled his contemporaries. He had adopted arquebuses earlier and more systematically than most daimyo. Not as a technological curiosity, as an engineering problem to be solved. The problem Nobunaga identified was not how to make the arquebus faster. Metallurgists were working on that, with no solution in sight. The problem was how to make the arquebus continuous without making it faster. Those are different questions. And the second one had an answer. If a single shooter needed a minute to reload, but you had 3 shooters rotating, the effective rate of fire tripled without any individual shooter having to act faster. It was a system solution, not a component solution, and Nobunaga had begun experimenting with it. But experimentation had a limit. Even with rotating shooters, the cavalry still arrived. You increased the casualties inflicted on the cavalry before contact, but contact inevitably happened. And at contact, your shooters were dead, unless you removed the contact, unless there was something that prevented the cavalry from reaching the shooters. It was a simple idea, almost absurdly simple. But simple and executable are different things, and no one had tested the combination at scale. Yet, in 1575, Katsuyori Takeda handed Oda Nobunaga the proving ground he needed. The spring of 1575 began with a siege. Katsuyori Takeda chose Nagashino Castle as his target, a fortress in the territory of Mikawa, the domain of Tokugawa Ieyasu. The choice had political and military logic. Nagashino controlled strategic routes. Taking it would be a declaration of power, a demonstration that the Takeda remained an expansionist force, and Ieyasu, Nobunaga's ally, would be directly struck. Okudaira Sadamasa commanded the castle. He had a small garrison, limited supplies, and no reasonable grounds to believe he could hold out against a Takeda force of approximately 15,000 men. But he held. Weeks passed. The garrison endured. Word reached Nobunaga. Nagashino was under siege. Ieyasu was calling for relief. For Nobunaga, this was not a simple request. It meant marching against Katsuyori with everything he had. It meant open confrontation. It meant putting his theory, the theory of palisades and rotating volleys, into practice in a real battle, against the most feared cavalry in Japan, with no second chance to refine the experiment. Nobunaga mobilized. He joined forces with Ieyasu and marched with a combined force of approximately 38,000 men. On paper, this looks like an overwhelming numerical superiority, more than double Katsuyori's force. But the numbers were deceiving. Cavalry weighs differently than infantry in open combat. 3,000 Takeda horsemen could disorder and destroy much larger infantry formations before the infantry could respond. Nobunaga's numerical advantage was real, but it guaranteed nothing. Katsuyori knew Nobunaga was coming. His spies reported the march, the size of the army, the direction. And here is the moment when history begins to reveal something fascinating about Katsuyori. He stayed. He did not retreat. He did not lift the siege and return to Kai to wait for a more favorable position. He stayed, positioned his forces on the open field of Shitaragahara, and prepared for battle. This seems irrational, and for centuries, historians treated this decision as the fatal mistake of a presumptuous leader. But the reality was more complex. Katsuyori had reasons to believe he could win. First reason, Nobunaga's positioning looked defensive, not offensive. A force that arrives and builds wooden and bamboo palisades is announcing that it does not intend to advance. It is waiting to be attacked. To Katsuyori, this could look like hesitation, insecurity, a force that, despite its numbers, did not trust its own capacity for open combat. Second reason, the Takeda cavalry had broken defensive lines before. It had forced seemingly solid positions. Decades of institutional memory said that the momentum of a well-executed charge had disordered even disciplined formations. What reason was there to believe bamboo stakes would be any different? Third reason, and this is the most important one, Katsuyori was under pressure from his senior generals. The Takeda commanders were men who had served under Shingen. They had reputations of their own. They had honor invested in the idea that the Takeda advanced, never retreated. Pressing Katsuyori to attack was not merely combat instinct, it was internal politics. So the decision was made. The Takeda would charge. And Nobunaga, on the other side of the plain, watched the enemy line take shape and knew that in the coming hours, either his solution worked, or the Takeda cavalry would reach his lines and the answer would be something else entirely. But before we witness the clash of troops, we must examine the architecture behind those palisades. Because the wonder of Nagashino was not the victory. It was the architecture that made victory inevitable. The plain of Shitaragahara was not a random choice. Nobunaga reached the terrain before Katsuyori had to make his decision. And when he arrived, he made a careful reading of the geography. The Rengogawa River ran in front of the position he intended to defend, not deep enough to be an absolute obstacle, but enough to disrupt a cavalry charge, to force the horses to cross it before accelerating, to absorb momentum before the main assault. The topography channeled any enemy advance towards specific angles. Nobunaga chose his defensive line to exploit exactly those angles. Then came the construction. The palisades of Nagashino were stakes, wooden and bamboo posts driven into the ground in rows with calculated spacing. Not a wall, not a fortress, a permeable barrier, with gaps open enough for a kneeling man to fire through them, but closed enough that a horse could not pass its speed. Here is what the fence did, and what it did not do. What it did not do, it did not stop cavalry permanently. A sufficiently determined rider could go around it, or a sufficiently large group could eventually dismantle them. Given enough time, the stakes were just wood. What it did, it removed momentum, and momentum was everything for heavy cavalry. A cavalry charge does not work because horses are invulnerable. It works because mass in motion is psychologically devastating and physically disordering. When cavalry crashes into infantry, it is the impact, the collision of hundreds of kilograms at high speed, that breaks the formation, creates panic, opens gaps. Remove the momentum before impact, and you transform cavalry from a shock force into stationary cavalry. To reach the palisades, the horses had to cross the river, regroup, accelerate again. When they reached the stakes, they had to stop, swerve, or try to force their way through. In any of those cases, they lost speed. And cavalry that stops cannot use the one resource that made it unstoppable: the collision. But here is where Nobunaga solved the second problem. He had approximately 3,000 arquebusiers. For the era, this was an extraordinary number. And instead of positioning them in a single formation, he divided them into rotating groups. While one group fired, the next group was already in position, ready to fire. And while that second group fired, the first was reloading. The result was near-continuous fire. Near-continuous is an expression that deserves a pause. We are not talking about a 19th century machine gun. There were intervals, there were misfires, but compared to the individual rate of fire of a single shooter, one shot every 30 to 60 seconds, Nobunaga's line was delivering projectiles at a frequency that had no precedent in Japanese battle up to that moment. And here was the crucial point. The palisades ensured that the cavalry remained within range long enough for the firing cycle to work. Think about the problem each part solves for the other. Without the palisades, the cavalry would reach the arquebusiers before the fire cycle could inflict enough casualties to stop the charge. With the palisades, but without the rotating volleys, the horsemen would wait for the arquebusiers to reload and charge during the window of vulnerability. Together, and only together, the two innovations completed each other. It was not a weapon, it was an architecture. Remember that bamboo fence that seemed absurd? You're starting to see why it wasn't a fence. But there was still a third element that Nobunaga had calculated, one that rarely appears in accounts of the battle: the discipline to hold position. It's easy to describe this in hindsight as obvious. It wasn't. Asking infantry, any infantry, to hold position while a charging cavalry advances was demanding something that went against every survival instinct. Men fled. Formations broke. Psychological collapse frequently preceded tactical collapse. Nobunaga knew this. The palisades provided physical cover. There was something between you and the horse. The arquebusiers saw the fire cycle working in practice, and there was strict military order, with punishments for anyone who broke the line. When the sun rose over Shitaragahara on the morning of June 28, 1575, Nobunaga had built something Japan had never seen. Not just a defensive position, a system. The Takeda were about to discover what that system did. The morning was humid. The rains of the previous month had soaked the ground, making the soil soft in spots no general had fully mapped. The Rengogawa River was carrying more water than usual. For the cavalry, this meant the crossing would be slower, more disorganizing than firm ground would have allowed. For Nobunaga, this was a favorable variable he hadn't planned for, and hadn't needed to. The armies watched each other through the morning mist. On the Takeda side, the cavalry formed up. Senior commanders occupied their customary positions. The men who had served under Shingen, who knew the tactics from the inside, who carried decades of experience in real battles. Yamagata Masakage, one of the most respected generals in Japan. Baba Nobuharu, with decades of battles on his record. Naito Masatoyo. Hara Masatane, a concentration of military capital that represented the living memory of the Takeda system. Katsuyori ordered the charge. The first wave of cavalry advanced across the plain with the confidence of decades of accumulated victories. It crossed the Rengogawa, slower than it would have been on dry ground, but still moving. It regrouped, accelerated toward Nobunaga's lines. The palisades were there. The first group of arquebusiers fired. White smoke covered the field. Horses fell, riders fell, but others kept coming. The Takeda cavalry had sufficient numbers to absorb the first casualties and remain in motion. Then the second group fired. This was the moment that defined everything. In previous battles, this would have been the interval, the window of vulnerability when the arquebusiers reloaded, and the cavalry used it to close the remaining distance. But the second group was ready. The projectiles kept coming. The cavalry no longer had a window. The horses reached the palisades and found what the palisades were built to do: forced stop. Horses slowed. Some fell onto the stakes. Others tried to veer toward the gaps, but the gaps were too narrow to pass through at speed. The momentum that made cavalry devastating dissipated in the moments the horses reached the barrier. And there, stopped or moving slowly, they were exposed to continuous fire. Yamagata Masakage was killed in that first wave, one of the most feared generals of the Sengoku period, killed by arquebus shot before reaching contact with the enemy infantry. Katsuyori ordered the second charge. This must be understood, not judged. From Katsuyori's perspective, the first wave had met unexpectedly heavy resistance, but the palisades could be overcome with sufficient mass. The second wave might have enough horsemen to force the gaps, to knock down the stakes, to create the breach the tactic required. It was the same reasoning that had worked in other battles against other defenses. The second wave met the same system. The volleys continued. The horses reached the palisades with the same result. More riders fell. Baba Nobuharu was killed. Naito Masatoyo was killed. Hara Masatane was killed. Third charge. Fourth charge. The exact count of the waves varies depending on the historical source, but the pattern is documented. Katsuyori kept ordering charges against the same system, with progressively worse results. Each wave lost riders who could not be replaced. Each wave destroyed the accumulated experience of a general who had served decades under Shingen. What was being destroyed was not merely flesh and armor. It was the Takeda system itself, the institutional memory, the command capital, the network of leaders who knew how to make the machine work. With each wave, the Takeda cavalry became a little less capable of being what it had once been. Why didn't Katsuyori stop? Here is the answer that history records. He probably tried. Retreat signals were sent at some point, but the battlefield had fragmented. Communications between Katsuyori and his commanders at the front were slow and uncertain. Some commanders were already dead. Others were committed to the charge and could not easily retreat without becoming more vulnerable targets than by pressing forward. The battle had surpassed centralized control. Katsuyori had inherited a machine that was larger than himself, and on that field, the machine consumed itself. That was when Nobunaga and Ieyasu advanced with the infantry. The Takeda horsemen who had survived the multiple waves were now caught between two sides, infantry advancing from the front and the flanks already compromised. The formation collapsed. What had begun as a series of organized charges turned into retreat, and then into rout. Katsuyori escaped, alive, but with an army that had entered the field of Shitaragahara as the most feared force in Japan and left as a fraction of its former self. The Battle of Nagashino lasted a few hours. The Sengoku period had witnessed longer battles, more chaotic ones, more numerous ones. But few battles in that era produced such definitive consequences in so little time. The Takeda still existed, but what made them the Takeda? Their cavalry, their generals, their capacity to project force, had been destroyed on a wet June morning on a plain that today lies in Aichi Prefecture. The numbers are incomplete, as they always are for battles of the Sengoku period, but estimates of Takeda casualties point to a catastrophic level of losses among their fighting force. The specific numbers are less revealing than the list of names. Yamagata Masakage, Baba Nobuharu, Naito Masatoyo, Hara Masatane, Sanada Nobutsuna, Sanada Masateru, Tsucha Masatsugu. Those names, to the Japan of 1575, were institutions. Each represented decades of military experience, networks of vassals and warriors trained within a specific system, living memory of the tactics that Takeda Shingen had developed. When those men died at Nagashino, it was not only combat personnel that the Takeda lost. It was the knowledge that made the system intelligent. Cavalry without its generals is cavalry without calibration. It can advance, it can charge, it can do what horses and riders individually know how to do. But the tactical intelligence, the sense of when to charge, from what angle, with what coordination with the infantry, that intelligence resided in the men who died at Nobunaga's palisades. Katsuyori survived. He returned to Kai and tried to rebuild. He raised armies, sought alliances, continued functioning as the feudal lord of a domain that still existed on the map. But Nagashino had set in motion a process that was slower than a battle, but more definitive. Allies began to recalculate. Daimyos who had maintained relations with the Takeda out of political calculation, because the Takeda were powerful and ignoring them was risky, now reassessed. The balance of power had shifted. Maintaining loyalty to the Takeda was less and less a strategic investment and more a liability. Nobunaga continued to expand. Over the following 7 years, the Takeda's political space shrank methodically. Allies defected. Territory was lost. The combined pressure of Nobunaga and Ieyasu never fully ceased, and Katsuyori, without the military force he had inherited intact, had no way to reverse the process. In 1582, 7 years after Nagashino, the Takeda clan was destroyed. Katsuyori died, ritual suicide, surrounded, with no options. The lineage that Takeda Shingen had built ended not in an epic battle, but in the logical conclusion of a process that Nagashino had set in motion. For Nobunaga, Nagashino was the inflection point that made the project of national unification not merely possible, but probable. The removal of the Takeda as a military force in central Japan opened spaces that he and Ieyasu filled methodically. Nobunaga would not live to complete the unification. He would be assassinated in 1582, the same year as the Takeda's extinction, a historical coincidence that encapsulates the period. But the pieces he had positioned would continue until Ieyasu completed them decades later with the Tokugawa shogunate. But there is something broader that Nagashino revealed. It was not only the Takeda that had ended. It was a specific era of how Japanese warfare worked. Cavalry would continue to exist as a weapon. It did not vanish overnight. But the idea that heavy cavalry was the decisive force, the force around which all other elements orbited, that idea had come to a close at Shitaragahara. What came next was a world where collective discipline and firepower outweighed mobility and individual impact. A world that, not by coincidence, favored generals like Nobunaga who had thought in systems, not in champions. But Nagashino was not the first time Japan had stopped cavalry with physical barriers. There was a precedent 294 years earlier. In completely different circumstances, with a barrier built of stone and earth at the water's edge against a threat of incomparably greater scale, and the principle had been the same. In 1274, Kublai Khan sent the first Mongol invasion force to Japan, landing at Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu. The Japanese fought as warriors of the feudal period were accustomed to fighting, with individual combat, with cavalry, with personal combat tactics that had been refined over centuries of internal warfare. The Mongols did not fight that way. The Mongol force operated in coordinated formations, with a collective discipline that had no precedent in Japanese military experience. The Japanese were pushed back. The invasion was partially contained by a storm, not by Japanese swords. The shock ran deep. What the Japanese did next was instructive. They didn't just train differently. They didn't just develop new warriors. They built. Over the following years, along the coast of Hakata Bay, Japan erected the Genko Barui, the anti-Mongol barrier, a stone and earthen wall roughly 20 kilometers long, stretching along the coast where the Mongols had landed. It was not a fortress, it was a barrier, a calculated physical structure designed to do one thing: prevent cavalry from landing and establishing itself inland. In 1281, Kublai Khan sent the second invasion, this time with an estimated force of 140,000 warriors across two separate fleets, the largest amphibious operation in medieval Asian history. They landed at Hakata Bay again, and they found the barrier. The Genko Barui worked exactly as it had been designed. It prevented the Mongols from leaving the beaches and pushing inland. The cavalry that had swept across continents, from China to Persia, was trapped on a narrow strip of coastline, confined alongside their vessels, with no room to maneuver, no terrain to exploit the momentum that made Mongol cavalry devastating. The Japanese fought along the barrier's line. Weeks passed. The Mongol force, confined, suffered casualties without achieving the breakthrough a land campaign would have delivered. Then the typhoon came. What the Japanese called kamikaze, divine wind, destroyed the Mongol fleet. Most of the warriors drowned or fell in combat over the weeks that followed. The invasion was extinguished. But here is what is so often lost in the narrative of the miraculous typhoon. The typhoon was decisive because the barrier had worked. If the Genko Barui had not pinned the Mongols to the beaches, if the cavalry had pushed inland, captured territory, established positions, the typhoon would have damaged the fleet but would not have ended the invasion. There were enough soldiers on land to keep fighting. It was the barrier that made the typhoon final. What connects 1281 and 1575 is a principle that appears repeatedly throughout military history, yet one that humans keep underestimating. Mobility is the force multiplier of cavalry, and any physical obstacle that neutralizes that mobility removes the multiplier. It requires no equality of strength. It requires no superior technology. It requires only the recognition that the force you face has a specific mechanism, and that mechanisms can be interrupted. Nobunaga did not invent this principle. He applied it with a precision and at a scale no one had attempted before in Japanese combat with firearms. And in that sense, the bamboo palisades of Nagashino were the Genko Barui of the 16th century. Go back to the beginning. June 28, 1575. The Takeda cavalry charges toward a line of bamboo stakes. Viewed from outside of history, it seems absurd, the most feared force in Japan against a wooden fence. But you already understand what was happening. It was not a fence. It was a system. A system that removed the single element that made the Takeda cavalry unstoppable: momentum. And without momentum, the cavalry was no longer the Takeda cavalry. It was cavalry standing still within range of rotating fire. Nobunaga did not defeat the Takeda by being stronger. He defeated them by removing what made them strong. That distinction matters beyond the 16th century. Every force considered unstoppable has a specific mechanism that produces its superiority, and mechanisms can be interrupted. The question is not, how do I become stronger than this? It is, what makes this powerful, and how do I remove that? A 20-kilometer wall at Hakata, rows of bamboo stakes at Shitaragahara. Neither was supernatural genius. They were correct answers to the correct question. The unstoppable is not unstoppable. It is unstoppable within the conditions that sustain it. Change the conditions. That is what a bamboo fence did to the most feared samurai in Japan. Which other unstoppable force in history do you want to see taken apart like this? Leave it in the comments. And if that question, not what happened but why it worked, is the kind of thing that keeps you here, the next video is already waiting.